Today is in fact Sparta Day, so forgive me if I'm actually a bit extra enthusiastic today. We will cover many interesting and wonderful things in this course, but today is a particularly special day for me. I am in fact a Spartan specialist in terms of my own research as a scholar. Sparta is in fact a polis that has held fascination for many from antiquity onwards. As I mentioned, Sparta was one of the major Greek powers in the classical period, but even more significant to the fascination Sparta has held for so many writers and thinkers throughout the ages is the perception of Spartan society as particularly unique or even downright odd. Even during the classical period, Sparta was perceived by many contemporary Greek writers within the world of not only mainland Greece, but within the larger Greek-speaking Mediterranean, as a particularly odd polis. Now, much of the perception of Spartan oddness can be traced to Sparta's role as Athens' primary antagonist during much of the classical period. Indeed, as you will see in future lectures, it is the struggle between Athens and Sparta that serves to characterize the classical period for most of Greek history in many, many respects. And again, much of the perception of Sparta as particularly odd or unique comes from this erroneous view, which is often held, indeed in scholarship as well, of Athens as being somehow the normalized or default Greek polis, if you will. You'll recall that I mentioned last class that Athens and Sparta were in fact both atypical polis by the standards of their contemporaries. They were just odd in different ways. For instance, the Athenian historian Thucydides' thesis regarding Athenian and Spartan enmity during the classical period is that they were essentially polar opposites in terms of their societies and worldviews. And because of this diametrical opposition in worldviews and the power held by each polis, it made it inevitable that they would eventually come into conflict. But it is because, as we will discuss, our sources from this period are very Athenocentric that the opposition between the Spartan and the Athenian worldview is often presented as Athens being normal and Sparta being odd. And it's interesting to note when we think of Athens and by extension ancient Greece, we tend to think of democracy, and this seems natural to us, like, of course, Athens is the birthplace of democracy. And this kind of perception of the naturalness of associating ancient Greece with democracy in particular is in fact a very false perception of the Greek world, which was created largely, at least in North America, by the American founding fathers' views that they were somehow the sort of political descendants of the Athenians and their decision to use models from classical antiquity to form the American Constitution. When in fact, in the early classical period, as I mentioned, oligarchy was the most common form of government. The idea of having a democracy where even the poor or uneducated were able to have a say in polis government by certain intellectual thinkers as a very dangerous form of government. But we will discuss this idea more when we look at Athens in greater detail. Now, of course, there are a number of other factors that would contribute to the sort of legendary status that Sparta would eventually come to take on, which indeed continues to this day if you consider things like the comic/movie 300 and the picture it paints about Spartan society. And while I really wish we had time to get into all the intricacies, we do in fact have a lot to cover in this course and a lot to cover for Sparta. And so sadly, we only have time for the very broad view on Sparta. Incidentally, if you do find yourself interested by this lecture and want to know more about Sparta, the University of Calgary does quite often offer courses on Spartan history and society, which are definitely worth checking out, I say with a complete objectivity, of course. Okay, so let's get into the subject matter. Let's first talk about our sources. Now, one of the main problems we have when we look at Sparta is that we have virtually no sources that were written by the Spartans themselves. We do have archaeological evidence, although, as we shall see, much less of this too than for Athens. And we do have some fragments from 7th century Spartan poets such as Tyrtaeus and Elkman, but really this is pretty much it for the classical and archaic periods. However, because Sparta was a major power in the Greek world, other authors from outside of Sparta, many authors from outside of Sparta wrote a considerable amount about her. Although this, too, is not without its problems because, as I mentioned, in the classical period especially, our sources are very ethnocentric. So we tend to get one of two things. That's either sources that are blatantly hostile to Sparta and critical of Sparta, and therefore tend to emphasize their perceived Spartan oddness, or conversely, on the other end of the spectrums, we have sources that greatly admire Sparta and Spartan society and then tend to emphasize or perhaps even exaggerate the societal features that they admire. And therefore, as a result, they tend to emphasize Sparta's perceived oddness. So you can get the picture that even on both ends of the spectrum, we end up getting the same issues, just in different directions. So the most important literary sources we have are Herodotus from Halicarnassus in Asia Minor, a historian who wrote about the Persian Wars in the first half of the 5th century and who we will discuss in greater detail in the Persian Wars lecture. We have an Athenian by the name of Thucydides. He was also a historian. He wrote about the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta in the second half of the 5th century, and we will discuss him more in the Peloponnesian Wars lecture. In the 2nd century CE, we have a travel writer called Pausanias, who you are already familiar with. Remember, you looked at his description of Mycenae. And there are two in particular who I have a little spotlight on the slide here because they are arguably our best sources for the political and societal structure of Sparta. These are the 4th century Athenian philosopher and historian Xenophon, this happy-looking fellow over here. He wrote a history which covers the end of the Peloponnesian War. Indeed, it picks up where Thucydides leaves off, as we will discuss later. And his history would then continue on to cover the first 40 years of the 4th century, which were centered around Sparta, because this is the period of the so-called Spartan hegemony in Greece. He also wrote philosophical work about the Spartan constitution, although these are just a few of his contributions, because Xenophon was, in fact, a very prolific writer who authored many works across several genres. Secondly, we have the 2nd century CE philosopher and biographer Plutarch, who is pictured here. He wrote lives or biographies, if you will, of several famous Spartan figures from the archaic and classical periods, as well as a very interesting collection of Spartan sayings, which are definitely worth a read. You see, the idea of laconic speech is one that we get from Sparta, and while now describing someone as being laconic has come to mean that they don't say much at all. In antiquity, the Spartans were actually well known and quite famous for having perfected the art of using few words well. And Spartan or laconic sayings are usually quite witty. They're mostly these sort of pithy little one-liners that cut straight to the heart. For instance, people compared Spartan speech to literally being stabbed by a well-aimed thrust. And from our sources' accounts, getting straight to the point was something Spartans valued in others as well. For instance, one of my favorite stories about sort of laconic speech and its values is from Herodotus. And it's about some Samians who were in a bit of a tight spot and went to ask Sparta for aid. And Herodotus tells us, and I quote, when the Samians, who were expelled by Polycrates, came to Sparta, they came before the ruling men and made a long speech to show the greatness of their need. But the Spartans, at first sitting, answered that they had forgotten the beginning of the speech and could not understand its end. After this, the Samians came a second time with a sack and said nothing but this: "The sack wants flour." So to this the Spartans replied that they were over-wordy with the sack, but they did resolve to help them. So you can see that they really value getting straight to the point. I guess I could learn a thing or two from the Spartans, eh? But anyway, let's get to the point and talk about geography. Okay, so Sparta lies in the southeast corner of the Peloponnese, right in a region called Laconia. So here is our map of mainland Greece, and here is a zoom in on the Peloponnese with a Laconia right here in the yellow. And Sparta, if you can see on the slide, is right here where I have my cursor, right sort of in the middle of this region of Laconia by this river here. So as mentioned, the general region wherein Sparta is housed, if you will, is called Laconia, and this is how you will see it in most of your modern scholars who will talk about Sparta and the territory under their control. But it's worthy to note that, in fact, it's not until the Roman era that people started to refer to this region as Laconia. And in the classical period, which is where we're mainly focusing on Spartan society today, it was in fact called Lacedaemon. So do know that there is a difference in those sources. But if you see Lacedaemon or Laconia, they are in fact referring to the same region. So Sparta itself lies on the Eurotas River, that river you can see here on the map, and it lies in a very fertile, wide river valley. As mentioned last class, the Spartans are Dorian Greeks and descend from the Dorians who migrated down from the north, probably from the Thessalian region, during the Dark Age and came to settle mostly in the Peloponnese, although Dorians came to settle in Crete as well. In the early Archaic period, Sparta, in fact, developed much along the lines as other Greek polis. They weren't odd yet, if you will. And during the 8th century, we do get a synoicism between 5 villages in the region of Laconia that would, in fact, join together to form the polis of Sparta. So in the intro to his history of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides says this about the physical city of Sparta. Suppose the city of Sparta to be deserted, and nothing left but the temples and the ground plan. Future generations would scarce believe that the power of the Lacedaemonians was at all equal to their fame, and yet they own 2/5 of the Peloponnesus, and are the acknowledged leaders of the whole, as well as of numerous allies in the rest of Hellas. But their city is not built continuously. It has no splendid temples or other edifices. It rather resembles a group of villages, like the ancient towns of Hellas, and would therefore make a poor show. Whereas if the same fate befell the Athenians, the ruins of Athens would strike the eye, and we should infer their power to have been twice as great as it really is. And this is actually quite prophetic if you think about it, because if you went to Greece today and visited the remains and see what is left to us of classical and archaic Sparta and Athens, Athens does in fact come across as quite impressive and Sparta not so much. And if we didn't have historians the likes of Thucydides, the impression that he suggests is probably the impression of Sparta we would hold. Now this is because unlike the Athenians, who undertook some very impressive building projects during the classical period especially, constructing buildings like the Parthenon, which we'll discuss further in future classes, the physical structure of Sparta continued to be this grouping of villages around this sort of central area. Here you can see on the map, which contained the citadel on the Acropolis, the theater, and what is listed here as the forum, the agora or market.